Hello everyone. In this video I will show you how to create login and register forms using Visual Studio 2022, C++, the .NET Framework, and SQL Server. So it is necessary to download and install the SQL Server. Now let's click on Create a new project. And here let's select C++. Now here we need to find the CLR C++ project. So this is the option that we need to select. It is CLR empty project with the .NET Framework. So if you cannot find this option, you need to scroll down and you need to click on Install More Tools and Features. Then in this window, we need to select this component. It is called Desktop Development with C++. And here we need to expand Desktop Development with C++ and we need to select this option. It is called C++ CLE Support. Then we need to click on Modify. But in my case, everything is installed correctly. So I will just close this window. So this is the option that we need to select. It is CLR empty project with the .NET Framework. So let's select it and let's click on Next. In this window, we need to provide the project name, so I will call it My Restaurant Project. Now let's click on Create. Now the project has been created, so let's configure it. So let's click on Project, then Properties. And here let's select All Configurations. And for the platform, let's select x64. Now let's expand Linker and let's select System. Then in the subsystem, let's select Windows. Then let's select Advanced. And in the entry point, let's write Main. Now let's click on OK. Now we need to create the database. So let's click on View, then Server Explorer. And here let's create a new connection. So let's click on this button. So here I will select Microsoft SQL Server. Also, it is possible to uncheck this box. Now let's click on Continue. So I will connect to the server that is installed on my computer. So first let's write localhost. Then we need to provide the instance name. In my case, it is SQL Express. Now we can test the connection using this button. And here we can see that the connection is successful. Now we can select the database using this button. And here we have the list of the available databases. But I want to create a new database called My Restaurant. So here let's write My Restaurant. Now let's click on OK. So here we can confirm that we want to create the database. So let's click on Yes. Now the connection has been established, so let's expand it. And here we don't have any table, so let's create a new one. So let's make a right click, then add the new table. So I can modify the table name and I will call it Users. By default, it contains the ID, which is a primary key. So let's add a new column. And I will call it name. It will be of type varchar. And we can modify the length. So let's write 100. Let's add a new column and let's call it email. And let's add the password. So for the name, it should not be null. The same for the email. And the password should not be null. Also, I want that the ID be auto-incremental. So let's select it. And here in the property, I have to find identity. So this is identity. Let's expand it. And let's modify it to true. Also for the email, I want it to be unique. So this is email. Let's add unique. Now to create this table, we have to click on Update. And here let's click on Update Database. And here we can see that the table has been created. So we can close this page and we can refresh the table's node. So here we can see that we have this table. Now let's add a row into this table. So let's make a right click, then show table data. And here we can add a new row. So we don't need to provide the ID because it is auto-incremental. So let's provide the name and the email. Let's hit enter. And this row has been added. So here we can see that the first ID is 1. Now let's close this page. We can also hide the server. Now let's create the login form. So we can make a right click on the project, then add, then new item. And in this window we have to select UI for user interface, then Windows form, and I will call it login form. Let's click on add. So here we have this error. We need just to close this page and we need to restart Visual Studio. So let's open the previous project. Now let's open this form. So this is the user interface. We can increase the font. So let's select this window and let's go to font. So here I will select 16 as the size. Now let's add a label. So let's click on Toolbox, and also we can make this toolbox visible. So this is the label, and let's modify the text of this label. So let's modify the text property and let's write login. Also, I want to provide this label with the full width. So let's disable the auto size of this label. And let's put this text in the middle. So let's modify the text alignment. Let's select center. We can also modify the font of this label. So let's select font and let's select this value. Now let's add a new label. So let's modify the text and let's write email. Then let's add a text box. So I want to modify the object name of this text box. I want to call it TB like text box email. So let's find the name property and let's call it TB email. Now let's add a new label. Then let's add a new text box. Then let's modify the object name. So in the name property, I will modify the name of the object and I will call it TB password. Also, this text box is used for the password, so I need to hide the characters. So in the password car, I will use asterisk. Now let's add two buttons. Now let's modify the text of the two buttons. So let's select this one and let's modify the text. Let's write OK. And here let's write cancel. Also let's modify the object name. So in the name property, I will call this button btn OK. and for this one it will be btn cancel. We can also modify the background color, so let's select the window and let's modify the back color. So I can select this color, for example. We can also modify the height a little bit. We can also modify the title. Now let's add a listener to these two buttons. Let's start with the cancel button, so let's make double click on this button. So this method will be executed when we click on the cancel button. What I want to do here is to close the window. Now let's go back to the designer and let's add a listener to this OK button. So this method will be executed when we click on the OK button. What I want to do here is to read the text of the email and the password and to check if we have a user in the database or not. So first let's read the email and the password. Then let's check if any of these two fields is empty. So if the email is empty or the password is empty, we have to display an error message. And also we need to exit this function. Otherwise we can connect to the database to check if the email and the password are correct or not. So in the try, we will try to connect to the database. And if we have any error when we try to connect to the database, then we have to display an error message. So first we need the connection string. We can obtain the connection string from the Server Explorer. So let's select this connection and here we can copy this connection string. And let's paste it here. Of course here we need to add a second slash. Then let's establish the connection. So here we have an error because we need to add a new namespace. So we need to add this namespace. And here we can see that we don't have the error anymore. Now let's create the SQL query. So in this query, we will select all the rows from this table where the email is this value and the password is this value. Now we need to replace this value by the email and this value by the password. So here I will replace this variable in this query by the email, and also I will replace this variable in this query by the password. Now let's execute this query. So if we find the user in the database, then we can read the data of this user and then we can close this window. Otherwise, we need to display an error message. So this error message is email or password is incorrect. Now let's create a new class called user, which will store the data of the authenticated user. So let's make a right click on the project name, then add, then new item, and I will create this new class into a header file. So let's select header file and let's call it user.h. So this class has these public variables which correspond to the column names of the users table of the database. Now let's add this header file to the login form. So if we find the user in the database, then we can store the data of this authenticated user into an object of type user. So I will create a global variable called user. So I want it to be public and it is of type user. So I will call it user. And also I want to initialize it with the value null. So this is a global variable which is public, which means that we can access it from the outside of this class. Now let's initialize it if we find the user in the database. Now to test the application, we need to create the main method. So let's create a new C++ file that contains the main method. Let's select C++ file and let's call it Program.cpp. So in this file, first we will include the login form. Then we will initialize the application and we will create the login form. Then we will show the login form as a dialog. This means that we will wait till the end of the authentication. When the login form is closed, we can read the user object. If the user object is not null, this means that the authentication is successful. In this case, we will show the message successful authentication of and the name of the authenticated user. Otherwise, if the user object is null, then we will show the message authentication cancelled. Now let's run the application. So here we obtain this window. Let's click on OK. And here we have this error message. Please enter email and password. So let's provide a wrong email. And let's provide the password. Let's click on OK. And here we have email or password is incorrect. So let's correct the email. And let's click on OK. And here we have the message successful authentication of Bill Gates, and this message has been shown from the file Program.cpp. Let's click on OK. And let's run the application again. This time let's click on cancel. And here we have authentication cancelled from the file Program.cpp. Now let's click on OK. Now let's create the dashboard. So here let's select user interface and let's select Windows form. And here I will call it main form. So let's close this page and let's restart Visual Studio. Let's select the previous project. Now let's open this main form. So let's increase the size. And let's add two labels. Now let's disable the auto size of this label. So in the auto size, I will select false. Now I can provide this label with the full width. And also let's increase the font of this label. Also let's show this label in the middle of the window. So let's modify the text align property. And let's select this area. Now we can modify the text. So let's write welcome to dashboard. Also we can modify the anchor property of this label, so its width will be modified when we modify the width of the window. So this is the anchor property. We need to select this area. Now let's test the behavior of this label. So we can see that the width of this label will be modified when we modify the width of the window. Now let's modify the font of this second label. Also, I want to modify the object name of this label. So let's find the name property. So let's call it LB like label user info. Now let's go to the source code of this form. So let's make a right click, then view code. So here we have this constructor. I will modify it to provide it with a parameter of type user. And also I need to include the header file. Now I will use this object to initialize the label. So after the initialize method, I can initialize the label just here. So this label will show the information of the authenticated user. Now let's go to Program.cpp and let's modify it. So if the user object is not null, then we need to create the main form. So let's remove this and let's create the main form. But here we have this error because we need to include the header file. Now let's run the application. So let's log in using the correct email and password. And let's click on OK. And we obtain this dashboard. We can increase its width. And we can see in this label that we have the information of the authenticated user. Now let's create the register form. So in this window, let's select UI, then Windows Form, and I will call it Register Form. Now let's modify the font size. Here let's select 16. We can also modify the size. And let's add some components. So first let's add a label. Now let's disable the auto size of this label. So in the auto size, let's select false. And now we can modify the size. Also, let's set this text in the center. So in the text line, I will select center. Also, it is possible to increase the font size. Now let's modify the text of this label. So let's write register. We can also modify the title, so let's select the window. Then let's go to the text property. Now let's add other labels and text boxes. Let's modify the text of this label. And let's write name. Now let's add a text box. Now we can copy this label and this text box. So we have just to select both of them. Then we need to click on the control button and we need to drag these two components. Let's do the same thing again. Now let's modify the text of these labels. Then let's modify the name of these different text boxes. So let's select this one and let's call it TB like text box name. So we have to find the name property. This one, let's call it TB email. Then TB phone. This is TB address. This one is TB password. And finally, this is TB confirm password. So these two text boxes will be used for the password. So I need to hide the password. So let's select this first text box. Then in the password char, we have to write the character that will be used instead of the password. So I will write star. Let's do the same thing with this second text box. And in the password char, let's write star. Now let's add two buttons. Then let's modify the text and the name of these two buttons. So for the text of the first button, let's write OK. And for the second button, let's write cancel. Then let's modify the name. So for the name of the cancel button, it will be btn cancel. And for the OK button, I will call it btn OK. Now I need to add a link that allows the user to switch to the login form. So I need to add this component. It is called link label. And let's modify the text to write login. Also, I need to modify the name of this component. So I will call it LL like link label login. We can also change the background color. So let's select this window. Then let's go to the back color property. Let's select custom and let's select this color, for example. We can also disable resizing the window. To do this, we have to go to form border style and here let's select fixed single. Also, I want to show this window in the middle of the screen. So let's go to the source code. So to go to the source code, I have to make a right click, then view code. And in the constructor, I have to call the following function. So it is called center to screen. Now let's go back to the designer and let's add a listener to this cancel button. So let's make double click on this button. So this method will be executed when we click on the cancel button. What I want to do here is to close the window. So let's call the close method. Now let's go back to the designer and let's add a listener to this login link. So let's make double click on this link. So this method will be executed when we click on the login link. What I want to do here is to inform the application that the user wants to log in. So let's create a global variable called switch to login. So I want it to be public because I want to access it from the outside of this class. It is of type Boolean and I will call it switch to login. And I will initialize it with the value false. So by default, this variable is initialized to false because by default the user does not like to switch to login. But if the user clicks on the login link, this means that the user wants to switch to login. So in this function, we have to set this variable to true, then we have to close the register form. Now let's go back to the designer. And let's add a listener to this OK button. So let's make double click on this OK button. So this method will be executed when we click on the OK button. What I want to do here is to read the content of the different text boxes and to add a new user to the database. So first let's read the content of the different text boxes. So here I will read the content of the different text boxes. If any field is empty, I have to show an error message and I have to exit this function. So if any field is empty, I will show this message. Please enter all the fields. Now I need to check that the password and the confirm password are identical. So if the password and the confirm password does not match, I have to show this error message and I have to exit this function. Else I can connect to the database. So if I fail to connect to the database, then I have to show this error message. And here in the try, I need to connect to the database. So first let's create the connection string. So I can obtain the connection string from the Server Explorer. So I have to select this connection. And in the properties, I have to copy this connection string. So let's copy it. And let's paste it just here. Of course, I need to add a second slash here. Now let's open the connection. So here we have an error because we need to add a new namespace. So we need to use this namespace, which is called SQL client. And here we can see that we don't have the error anymore. Now let's create the SQL query. So this query allows us to add a new user into the table users. So I will add these variables into these columns. Now I need to replace these variables by the corresponding values. So here I will replace these variables of this SQL query by these strings that I obtained from the different text boxes. Now let's execute this SQL query. Then we need to save the data of the user into an object of type user, which will be returned to the main method. So let's create a global variable of type user. So I will create it just here. And it will be public because I need to access it from the outside of this class. So it is of type user. And I will call it user. Of course, I will initialize it with null. So here we have an error because I did not include the header file. So let's include it. Now let's initialize this object. So I will initialize it after executing the SQL query. And finally, let's close this register form. Now let's modify the login form. So let's go to login form.h. And here let's add a link that allows the user to switch to the register form. So let's add this link label and let's modify the text of this label. Let's write register. Also, let's modify the variable name. So let's select it and let's find the name property. So here I will call it LL register. Now let's add a listener to this link. So let's make double click on it. So this method will be executed when we click on the register link. What I want to do here is to notify the application that the user wants to register. So let's create a global variable of type Boolean that is called switch to register. So I want it to be public because I need to access it from the outside of this class. And it is of type Boolean. I will call it switch to register. And I will initialize it with false. So when the user clicks on the register link, I will modify the value of this Boolean. Then I need to close this login form. Now let's update the main method. So let's go to Program.cpp. And here we can remove all of this. And we can create an object of type user. Now let's create a while loop. So first of all, in this while loop, we need to show the login form. So when the login form is closed, we need to check if the user wants to switch to register. So if the user wants to switch to register, then we have to show the register form. And of course, we need to include the header file of the register form. So if the user wants to switch to the register form, we have to show the register form. Else, we have to read the user object from the login form and we have to exit this while loop. So when we show the register form to the user, we have to check if the user wants to switch back to the login form. So if the user wants to switch back to the login form, then we have to call continue, which allows us to go back to the beginning of this while loop. Else, we have to read the user object and we have to exit this while loop. Now let's run the application. So let's click on a register and we obtain this register form. Let's click on login, then register, then login, and we can see that it works fine. Now let's register a new user. So if I click on OK, I will obtain this error message. So let's provide all the other fields. So if I provide two passwords which do not match, then I click on OK, I obtain this error. Let's click on OK. And here we can see that the new user has been registered and we obtain this dashboard. Now let's close this application and let's run it again. Now let's log in using the new account. And we obtain this dashboard.